How's it going, everyone? Welcome to this week's Pioneer tier list. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying my content, be sure to like and subscribe. Also, I have a giveaway on Twitter right now. I'll be giving out 600 Magic Online play points as part of the Magic Online Content Creator Program, so get your entries in. How has the metagame adjusted this week, heading deeper into the RCQ season? Let's find out. Like always, let's start with the S tier. Once again, nothing really sits oppressively at the top of the metagame. We're even starting to see some of the early season contenders being pulled back towards the rest of the metagame, so once again, no S tier. Next up, we jump to the D tier. We start off with Izzet in Sol. This deck drops down from C tier from last week. It had a solid amount of play with 3% overall, 3% in the Premier metagame, 4% in the Winners metagame, and 1 top 8. But what we're seeing is that a lot of the other aggro decks, the ones that can use Slick Shot Show Off, are the ones that are rising to the top, whereas in Sol is starting to fall off. Next up, we have Humans. This deck put up a somewhat surprising set of finishes a couple weeks ago, really rising up, showing that it could handle some of the less interactive decks and attack them. This week, we're starting to see it come back to where it was before, back in the D tier, down from C tier, with 2% overall, 2% Premier, 3% in the Winners metagame, and 1 top 8. The deck still shows some resilience, being able to put up a top 8 and do better in the Winners metagame than overall, but I'm still not sold on it being a great contender moving forward. Next up, we have Azorius Control, which moves back down to D tier. Similar to Humans, it had a couple good weeks there, but seems to be falling back to where it was before. With 0 top 8s this weekend, makes it a bit of a challenge to get above D tier. Next up, we have Creativity, which we saw some innovation this week with the Vaultborn Tyrant version, joining Atraxa, Gear Hulk, and the combo versions, all of which generally see some degree of play. With 1 top 8, including a challenge win this week, it's interesting to see the Vaultborn Tyrant version. I'm not sure if it's better than the combo or the Atraxa version, but it's a new innovation, and it's nice to see that we're still getting some new threats for this deck to play. Next up, we have Spirits, which is down from C tier. It's been on a bit of a slide lately, and that continues this week with 0 top 8s. Both versions only put up 1% in each category for a total of 2% overall, 2% Premier, and 2% Winners. It just isn't putting up the results we'd like to see, and that makes a lot of sense given the amount of cheap interaction and removal floating at the top of the meta. Last up, we have Rakdos Midrange, which is a bit of a surprise given that we have Vampires having taken over that deck's meta share for the most part, but we're starting to see this version, the version that has Inti, Bone Crusher Giant, Graveyard Trespasser, a lot of the more mid-range threats that aren't synergy based but just good card based. We saw it have 3% overall, 3% Premier, 2% Winners metagame, but 2 top 8, and honestly it makes a lot of sense. This is a deck that should do well if you're seeing a lot of creature based aggro, and it does have enough game and speed with the Inti package to handle some of the non-interactive decks. Next up, we move to the C tier. We start off here with Lotus Field Combo, down from B tier last week, with 3% overall, 4% in the Premier metagame, 4% in the Winners metagame, and 1 top 8. The deck is still performing well, but it seems like it's not able to punish the mid-range decks as well, given the amount of creature-based aggro and combo decks that are able to punish it. I think this is still a solid choice, but along with another deck in this tier, we're starting to see the non-interactive combo that just has that as its main game plan start to fall off a little. Next up, we have Red Aggro, which moves down from B tier, even though we're seeing a ton of Gruul aggro. The just pure red version is not sustaining the same level of success as Gruul, and we're probably locking into the idea that red is the worst of the two options. With 6% overall, 5% Premier, 6% in the Winners metagame, but only 1 top 8, it's not quite living up to its counterpart. Next up, we have Heroic, which falls into a similar band with 2% overall, 3% Premier, 3% Winners, and 2 top 8. Like red, it's still a good choice and a solid option, but it's not living up to the other Slick Shot Show Off deck that we have in a higher tier. Last up, we have Contorious Combo, which joins Lotus Field, as I said, as the interactive combo decks that are somewhat all in on their plan. This deck has put up 3% across the board and 1 top 8 this weekend. I still think it has a lot of potential, being able to attack some of these mid-range decks that don't have a lot of great ways to fight it, but access to things like Play with Fire and Bitter Triumph that can answer your combo makes it a little challenging, along with the fact that you are very dependent without a lot of ability to filter to find your combo piece. Next up, we jump to the B tier, and here we have Mono Black Discard. Down from A tier, it really rocketed up to the top. At the start of of the format with OTJ, Kavrik doing great work, and it did continue to show a lot of promise, but we're starting to see that the deck isn't quite up to snuff with the other A tier decks as far as that continued success. It did have 9% overall, 8% in the Premier metagame, 9% in the Winners metagame, and 5 top 8s, so it's clearly still a step above the C tier. Not saying it doesn't deserve a place in the better options for any tournaments you're going to play, but it is a marked step down from where it had been even a week or two ago. Next up, we have Gruul Aggro, which, as we said, has taken over the mantle as the aggro deck with Slickshot Show Off, with 9% overall, 9% in the Premier metagame, and 10% in the Winners metagame, alongside 7 top 8s. It looks like Gruul is the aggro deck that's going to survive through the beginning part of this RCQ season. Next up, we have Amalia combo, which continues to sit in the B tier. It's one of the better decks at fighting some of these creature-based decks and can win out of nowhere. It put up a solid 6% overall, 6% Premier, but 8% in the Winners metagame with 7 top 8s, showing that it converted quite well. And again, with the amount of aggro and decks that want to try and tap out, not unreasonable that this deck can put a lot of decks in uncomfortable positions, gain a bunch of life, and have a lot of ways to close out the game, even from somewhat nowhere. Last up, we have the A tier. And while there's no surprises compared to last week, we do still have a dominating trio of decks here in the A tier. First up, we have Vampires, which put up 13% overall, 14% in the Premier metagame, and 13% in the Winners metagame, but only 6 top 8s shows that even though it's seeing a lot of play and doing a lot of winning, it wasn't able to convert quite as well. And we're starting to see this with both Vampires and Phoenix, where decks are targeting them, and they are actually starting to come back down to earth in terms of top 8s as well as dominating meta share. Speaking of Phoenix, that's the next deck with 12% overall, 12% in the Premier, and 11% in the Winners metagame, along with 6 top 8s. I think Vampires and Phoenix are both excellent choices. They are a definitive top deck, but we are, like I said, starting to see them come back down to earth. They're well ahead of most of the metagame and still a step ahead of most of the B tier decks, but even Gruul and Amalia had more top 8s this weekend, and some decks are starting to put pressure on that overall percentage. Last up, we have Niv-Delight. This deck put up the best results this weekend and really is starting to challenge for that seat as the top deck, with 10% overall, 11% in the Premier metagame, and 11% in the Winners metagame, with 11 top 8s. The deck has been crushing it lately. We've seen Ancient Cornucopia along with Pillage the Bog being huge upgrades. The mana base has been slowly getting refined every couple weeks as people discover casting Leyline Binding is an important part of the deck, and as we continue to see iterations of it, the deck continues to be able to attack the metagame well. And honestly, it's been sitting as a very strong deck for a little bit, but Pillage the Bog and Cornucopia really pushed it into that A tier, and now it's starting to fight for that top spot. Realistically, it may dethrone Vampires and Phoenix very shortly. And there you have it. That's this week's Pioneer tier list. Be sure to keep an eye out here for a Niv-Delight deck tech coming out this week, and good luck in your events this weekend. Until next time.